Hello, this is Dr. Jay Davidson from drjdavidson.com. I'm excited to welcome you to this very special segment of the Chronic Lyme Disease Summit. According to the CDC, there are more people affected with Lyme disease each year than breast cancer. That's including invasive and non-invasive together. Today, my special guest is Dr. Lyme Cowden, and we're going to take a comprehensive look at Lyme disease. But before we do a little bit about Dr. Cowden, William Lyme Cowden is a chairman of the Scientific Advisory Board and professor of the Academy of Comprehensive Integrative Medicine of Panama since 2008. He's USA board certified cardiologist and internist who is internationally known for his knowledge and skill in practicing and teaching integrative medicine. He's co-authored 6 different books. His first one was An Alternative Medicine Definitive Guide to Cancer. Second book was Cancer Diagnosis, What to Do Next. Third book was Longevity, An Alternative Medicine Definitive Guide. Fourth book was Create a Toxin-Free Body and Home. His fifth book was Foods That Fit a Unique You, and his most recent one was Bioenergetic Tools for Wellness. He's also contributed to several other books and publications. He's actually the creator of the Cowden Support Program, which is an all-natural program that's been used successfully by several thousand people to support their bodies during recovery from various chronic inflammatory conditions, including Lyme borreliosis with co-infections. So Dr. Cowden, I want to welcome you to the summit.
Thank you, Dr. J. I really appreciate being on here with you.
So you've been in the Lyme world for quite a few years. When did you first get involved in the Lyme disease world or the Lyme borreliosis world?
Yeah, in the fall of 2002, a naturopathic friend of mine brought her grandson over to an international cancer symposium that I was hosting in Fort Worth, Texas. And she told me that he had been to a Lyme literate physician, and the Lyme literate physician said he had advanced Lyme disease, including borreliosis in his brain. And the doctor had put him on very powerful pharmaceutical antibiotics, and the boy had gotten progressively worse rather than better. And she said, what can we do for him? And I thought, well, this Peruvian cat's claw is supposed to be very powerful antimicrobial and also an anti-inflammatory. Why don't we energetically test that? So we did that at the conference, and it tested very good. And so I suggested she take him back to the Lyme literate physician, get permission to come off the antibiotics, and start the Peruvian cat's claw. And they left. And I learned weeks later that she had taken him to his house, and without telling his grandmother or his parents, he stopped the antibiotic on his own and started the Peruvian cat's claw. And in 2 weeks' time, he was a whole lot better. In 2 months' time, he was completely well. And the naturopathic practitioner had him on a bunch of other detox and support things. So it wasn't like the Peruvian cat's claw was the only thing necessary to get him well. She just added that to what he was already on. So she went back to the Lyme literate physician with him and said, the combination of these natural things made him well. And the doctor said, no, it's not possible. He's got advanced Lyme disease, and there's no natural program that'll get rid of Lyme disease. And she said, no, I'm pretty sure it was the combination of the natural products. And so he said, well, I'll prove it to you. I'll send you some patients. So he sent her 58 patients with advanced Lyme disease that weren't getting well with antibiotics. And each one of them got 30 to 50% improvement in about 3 months' time. So she wanted to do a controlled study with me. She said, I want to, do this in a more scientific way. And so we got him to refer 28 patients to our study, 14 pairs of patients. They were paired by age and sex and degree of illness and so on. So he kept half of them in his group that he treated with the best allopathic therapy that he knew to give them. And our 14 patients went through the natural therapies without any pharmaceuticals. In our control group, we had by 10 weeks marked improvement in each of our natural treatment patients, but the allopathic doctor had very little, if any, improvement in his control group. And by 18 weeks into the study, we had even greater improvement in our natural treatment group and still no significant improvement in the allopathic control group. So we knew that the combination of natural therapies could make a difference in these patients with advanced neuroborreliosis and co-infections, even though pharmaceuticals were not helping.
Wow, that's just phenomenal, Dr. Cowden. So let's maybe back up a little bit. And I mean, as a practitioner that's been, in the Lyme disease or Lyme borreliosis world for so long, I mean, what kind of symptoms or type of conditions can really be affected, or do you see present when somebody's dealing with chronic Lyme disease or chronic Lyme borreliosis?
Well, Lyme borreliosis is known as the second great imitator. It can show up as a variety of different illnesses. If your listeners look at the nutramedix.ec website, nutramedix.ec website, They can find there on the science section. The next to last article talks about 300 plus illnesses that are caused by Lyme disease or that mimic Lyme disease. So you can't really distinguish between one and the other, and probably there's causation links. Click on any one of those 300 plus illnesses, it takes you to the website on the internet that has the article that shows you the connection between those different illnesses. So, Lyme disease can mimic multiple sclerosis or myelopathy or polyneuropathy or brain tumors or encephalopathy, as well as acute neurological illnesses like meningitis, encephalitis, neuritis, mania, manic depressive illness, obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, schizophrenia, anorexia, dementia. And Lyme disease can also show up as cardiovascular disease, cardiomyopathy, congestive heart failure, arrhythmias, conduction disturbances, and heart blocks that might require a pacemaker. And 90% of patients with chronic fatigue syndrome have been tested to be Lyme positive. So there's probably a causation in
90%?
90%, yeah.
Wow. So explain to me, why does Lyme disease not get diagnosed more often than if these people with, these quote unquote other symptoms, conditions, and other, diagnoses, why is Lyme not included into that?
Well, it's not taught significantly in the medical schools. So, most doctors learn about it kind of after the fact. And many doctors think that Lyme disease is only present in the area around Lyme, Connecticut, where it was first described in the United States. But it's present in every state of the United States as well as most countries across the globe. So it's a worldwide pandemic. We have 300,000 plus new cases diagnosed in the United States every year, according to the Center for Disease Control estimate. And, that's the number one leading infectious disease in the world right now. So it's a rampant condition, and it's a disabling condition as well. But a lot of doctors also think that the patient can't have Lyme disease unless they have the typical bullseye rash, the red spot with a clear area around that and then another ring of red around that. And it's just not so. The studies clearly show that at least 30% of patients with acute Lyme disease don't have the bullseye rash, maybe as many as 50%. And, we have really high false negative results on the blood test. Some estimates are as much as 50% of the blood tests are negative for Lyme disease, even though the patient has Lyme disease.
And you're referring to Western blot and the standard ELISA?
Yeah. The Center for Disease Control says if you want to diagnose Lyme disease, you need to do the ELISA test or the immunofluorescent test. If that's positive, then do the Western blot to confirm. But the ELISA and the immunofluorescent test are notoriously falsely negative, and so the doctors don't even go on to measure the Western blot because, according to the Center for Disease Control recommendations, they're not supposed to. And William Harvey and Patricia Salvato in Houston, Texas, back in about 2000, had 450 patients in the practice with chronic fatigue syndrome and a variety of other symptoms, and they did the Borrelia testing on all of those patients. And on the first test, about a third of them were positive for Lyme disease. They thought that Lyme disease only existed in the northeastern United States, but they found that it was prevalent there. And the only reason that testing happened is because Dr. Harvey had amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, the crippling neurological disease, and tested himself for Lyme disease and found it was positive and treated himself with high-dose intravenous antibiotics and got over the ALS. So he knew that there was likely much more Lyme disease in Houston, where he had always lived, than was expected. Anyway, when they did the second round of testing on the patients that were negative on the first round, they found some more that were positive. And when they did the third round of testing on the ones that were negative on the first two rounds, they found some more that were positive. So over the course of a year, the vast majority of those patients had positive tests for borreliosis. And when they started treating them, many of them started getting over the chronic symptoms that they had.
Wow. And I'd heard before, too, that the whole, medical standard of practice testing the ELISA and then, second tier with the Western blot, that was actually originally done as more of an observational method to try to see, how many people are affected with Lyme disease and not ever really intended for a diagnostic. But it seems as if that's, creeped in and kind of been the standard protocol. So I definitely don't think there's a lot of accuracy with that testing either. Let's talk about co-infections. What do you see as being kind of the common co-infections that are associated with Lyme disease?
In the United States, Bartonella species are very common co-infections, and also Babesia. Now, Dr. Fry at the Fry Laboratories in Phoenix has now found that a lot of patients with Lyme disease also have an unusual protozoal parasite called Protomyxozoa. And that Protomyxozoa is a biofilm-forming single-cell microbe. And the biofilm is kind of like a snot that comes out of the nose and surrounds the bug and hides the bug from the immune system and protects the bug from antibiotics as well as natural therapies that would be used. So you usually have to break down the biofilm in order to have any hope of getting rid of the Protomyxozoa. But not just the Protomyxozoa hiding in this biofilm, it's also, a variety of other microbes, including Borrelia and Bartonella and Rickettsia. The Rickettsia species that are most common as co-infections in Lyme disease are Ehrlichia and Coxiella and Anaplasma, and occasionally even Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And then there are several hundred species of Mycoplasma that are common co-infections. In other words, they get into the body at the same moment that the Borrelia gets into the body. And then Dr. Eva Sappi at the University of New Haven, Connecticut, has identified a microfilaria. So it's a little microscopic worm, a roundworm that causes a lot of disease in the body. And it may be the same bug that Dr. Claypow identified in patients with chronic Lyme disease. That one's called V. claypowi. Anyway, all of these bugs collectively can create a massive amount of symptoms and disease conditions in patients. And that's one of the challenges in Lyme disease. They have such diverse presenting symptoms. The doctors say, well, what is the cause of all of this? And they oftentimes blame it on psychiatric illness, or they blame it on fabricated illness. We call it Munchausen syndrome. It's just because the doctors are uneducated, they don't look. But, these species of co-infections, typically like the standard doctor will look for one species or two species of Bartonella, but there's 31, 32 species that are known to be pathological in humans, according to the researcher down in Lima, Peru. And they only look for one or two species. So if the person has one of the other 30 species that they're not looking for, then there's a high chance that the patient will be sick from that and the condition will go undiagnosed. There's several dozen species of Babesia, and typically they only look for one species of that. There's 8 species of Protomyxozoa that Dr. Fry has already identified. And, most doctors don't even know about Protomyxozoa or test for it. Mycoplasma, as I said, there's hundreds of species, and, typically they test for at most 3 or 4 species of Mycoplasma. So it's a big problem because there's so many different microbes that could be coexisting and affecting the patient.
Do you believe that that's really a big piece to why there's such a diversity of symptoms in the Lyme disease community is based on the different type of co-infections that are associated with it too?
I think that's a big part of it, but the Borrelia itself, if a person has only Borrelia and none of the co-infections, can still have very diverse presentations. Some patients have predominantly gastrointestinal disease. Some patients have primarily arthritic, joint conditions. Some patients have mostly neurological involvement. Some patients have mostly cardiovascular involvement. And, I was perplexed why that was the case for a time, and then I reflected on some of my experience with other patients from the past with other conditions. And what I came to understand and believe is that the microbes, the Borrelia, for example, will hang out in the body wherever there's an accumulation of physical toxins, because the bugs are not really severely adversely affected by the toxins, the pesticides, the herbicides, the heavy metals, and so on. But the white blood cells are very much affected by that and can't function in that environment. So the bugs get into that place where there's a high load of toxins and then thrive because the white cells can't get in there and do anything against them. And back in the early 90s, I figured out that the toxins accumulate in specific places in the body because of unresolved toxic emotions. So the Chinese told us 3,000 years ago that if you have unresolved anger, frustration, you will have trouble in your liver. Well, trouble equates to physical toxin accumulation in the liver. And so if you have unresolved anger, you're going to get physical toxin accumulation in the liver, and you're going to get more Borrelia affecting the liver than any other organ if that's the primary emotion. Wow,
that's really great to understand. You'd mentioned the man with ALS recovering from antibiotics. Was it IV antibiotics back in 2000? So often we see people with chronic Lyme that have been really failures of kind of that more standard antibiotic therapy. Why do antibiotics typically not resolve somebody's Borrelia infection or Lyme, with co-infections?
Well, there's a couple of studies actually published back in 95 and 96 in the peer-reviewed literature, and it showed that within 2 hours after exposure of Borrelia to an antibiotic, that the Borrelia starts forming little granules along its cell membrane. So the Borrelia is a spiral-shaped bacteria, maybe 20 to 50 times longer than it is wide. And along its side, it forms these little outpouchings, and these outpouchings contain all the DNA, all the genetic material necessary to make an entire new spiral-shaped bacteria. But these granules are actually completely impervious to antibiotics. So these granules can persist in the body for days, weeks, months, or years while the antibiotics are given. And when you finally stop the antibiotics, the Borrelia granules start transforming back into spirochetes, and the spirochetes are very invasive. I've watched under dark field microscopy a Borrelia organism invading a human cell, and it's absolutely fascinating. It goes in just like a corkscrew. The tip of the Borrelia touches the cell membrane and it just starts twisting and goes in within a second or two. And so that's one of the mechanisms by which the Borrelia hides itself. We call that pleomorphism, when it changes shapes and hides, so it can form biofilm colonies. The Borrelia is also a big biofilm former, snot producer, if you will, to hide itself in. And Dr. Eva Sapi did quite a bit of work on that at the University of New Haven to see what kind of therapies could get at the Borrelia inside that biofilm. Other things that influence the ability of the Borrelia to persist and exist in the presence of antibiotics, besides the pleomorphic nature and also the biofilm, is the fact that it is very capable of mutating genetically. So the Borrelia has 21 different plasmids. Those are segments of DNA that allow it to mutate. And the next closest competitor microbe only has 7. The next closest competitor below that one is only 3. Now, those 2 microbes, the one with 7 plasmids and Borrelia with 21 plasmids, very likely were genetically engineered microbes. We have good evidence that the Borrelia was initially being produced as a biowarfare in Germany during the Second World War. And so that continued, unfortunately, after the Second World War, and they further developed it and perfected it. So it now is a worldwide problem.
So explain to us and myself too with the plasmids, 21 different plasmids. I mean, it's like 3 times more than the next, pathogen or bacteria on the list, which is just phenomenal when you look at that and think of that. But how does that allow the Borrelia to actually alter the DNA? Or, explain that to us.
Yeah, well, the Borrelia can use those different genetic plasmids, those different segments of DNA, to turn on and turn off not only its own production of proteins and other things, but it can actually use it to turn on and turn off human genes.
Oh, wow.
So that makes it even more virulent. And one of my colleagues in Amsterdam made a brilliant discovery. He found that if a Borrelia is in the body and encounters another bacteria, that the Borrelia can share all of its genetic material with that other microbe and basically merge the genes of both species into one species. So the outcome species is not Borrelia, and it's not the other species that the Borrelia bumped into. It's a third species. And so we call that he called that a double. So it's basically double the DNA of what Borrelia has by itself. If that bug bumps into another species of bacteria, a 4th species, then the outcome from that encounter is not any one of the previous 4 species. It's a 5th species, which has triple the genetic material. And each time there's a combining of genetic material from other species, then the microbes are picking up additional mutation capability, because we have microbes that have developed a spontaneous resistance to antibiotics, for example. And so if you have been to the hospital and you picked up some of the hospital bugs there that have become multi-drug resistant, let's say a multi-drug resistant Staph aureus, and now the Borrelia bumps into that bug and they share genes with each other, the offspring of that is a double with much more drug resistance than the Borrelia or the other bug.
Wow, that's literally scary to think about, the ability to morph. It's almost like it can genetically modify itself just based on the plasmids. Would you consider the plasmids essentially to be ways where it can just, almost like epigenetics, where it can just kind of genetically flip the switches on and off essentially?
Exactly, yeah. So the bug is always sensing its environment, and if it senses a particular antibiotic, then it turns on the gene that will produce the protein that will switch the human gene production, so the patient becomes resistant to the antibiotic that would be used to treat the Borrelia.
So give me some hope, Dr. Cowden. I mean, for those people, when you start to understand the complexity of, really the Lyme bacterial Borrelia and understand the ability to morph genes and change and then take antibiotics, and it can, not only change shapes and go into the cyst form and, produce granules. So then when you stop antibiotics, obviously then it thrives. What hope is there for people recovering, not only just with chronic Lyme disease, but that maybe have had multiple courses of antibiotics that really failed them?
Yeah, well, that study that we did end of 2002 and early 2003 helped us to understand that there was a very good hope for people that had chronic borreliosis, even neuroborreliosis, using natural therapies. A lot of the herbal antimicrobials don't have a single chemical in them that has an antimicrobial effect, but they'll have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different antimicrobial agents in one herb. And so the more different species of herbs that have an antimicrobial effect that you give to a patient with borreliosis, the less likely it is that the Borrelia can outsmart that or outthink that and survive in the presence of all those different antimicrobial agents. We saw, for example, on dark field microscopy, some fascinating things. In that study, we were using, as I mentioned, Peruvian cat's claw. And the Peruvian cat's claw has at least 3 different antimicrobial agents in it, maybe more agents. When we did the dark field microscopy on those patients on the first day of the study, before they'd received any antimicrobial agents, their bloodstream was swarming with Borrelia, spirochetal bugs, as well as Babesia and Bartonella and a variety of other microbes. And just 11 days later, 11 days into the treatment with the Peruvian cat's claw, they had drastically reduced number of microbes in the bloodstream. And 2 weeks after that, even less, almost none. And then 2 weeks after that, we couldn't find a single microbe in the serum. But when we crushed the red blood cells, we saw the microbes coming out of the crushed red cells. And 2 weeks after that, we didn't see any in the serum. And when we crushed the red cells, a lot fewer microbes coming out of the crushed red cells. And by the 10th week, when we crushed the red cells, there were no microbes coming out of the crushed red cells either. So when you use these natural remedies with multiple antimicrobial agents in one product, you're killing off the different species of microbes sequentially and taking the load off the immune system. Many of the chemicals that Borrelia produces are immune suppressive, and same thing for Bartonella. So if you're killing off those bugs that are producing the immune suppressive substances, then the immune system comes up and starts helping the patient get rid of the other critters that might not have a microbial agent on board to get rid of. It's my opinion that it's not until about the 18th or subsequent week that you finally get enough antimicrobial agents into the other cells of the body, like the brain cells and the liver cells and the joint cells and so on, to get rid of the bugs that are inside those cells. Borrelia is mostly an intracellular parasite, intracellular infection, and that makes it more challenging to get rid of because you don't get very high levels of antimicrobial agents inside the cell, whether it's a pharmaceutical antibiotic or an herb. But the herbs do penetrate the cell better than a lot of the pharmaceutical antibiotics do.
Talking about maybe some typical protocols or how you view Lyme, because everybody is different that's dealing with chronic Lyme and different symptomatologies, different areas that are more, susceptible or different injuries and traumas they've had in the past. But when you're looking at natural herbal therapies with, multiple antimicrobial type properties to them, kind of given the variety, are you a big fan of kind of the slow and low dosing and workup, or maybe more of kind of the pulsing where you're given a dose, take a break, give a dose? What's your professional thoughts in that category?
Yeah, well, after the official pilot Lyme study in Dallas in 2003, I continued to follow some of the patients that were in that study to figure out what was the best products to use, what was the best dosing schedule, whether it was necessary to take breaks with the dosing schedule, and if so, how long those breaks should be. So that's what took place over the next 2 or 3 years after that. So what I found in that trial and error investigation with individual patients is that there's certain products that are absolutely essential in the program, like at least 1, if not 2 or 3 or 4 different herbal antimicrobials. The drainage remedies are essential to make sure you support and help the kidneys and the liver and the gallbladder and the bile ducts and the lymph and so on to clear the carcasses and the poop of the dead and dying microbes from the body. And magnesium was essential, even though some people say magnesium feeds biofilm formation. I found that patients can't get well without it. So you just deal with the biofilm at the same time that you give them magnesium. I found that you have to do something to bind the metals to get the metals out of the body, because the metals continue to stimulate the bugs to grow and so on. But what I found in all that process is that you absolutely have to have enough days on the antimicrobial agents to kill the bugs that are in the body at that time, and then a few days off so that the pleomorphic forms, the hiding forms, can come out of hiding and transform back into the invasive forms, and then you immediately restart the antimicrobial agents and kill off the bugs that have come out of hiding. And by doing that in a pulsatile fashion, you get the best of both worlds. You kill bugs and then get rid of the hiding forms too. If you just give continuous antimicrobial agents, whether it's herbs or pharmaceuticals, I find that when you finally do stop the treatment, that the pleomorphic bugs like Borrelia especially will come out of hiding and repopulate the body just as if you'd never treated. So the best regimen that I found in those days was 12 to 12 and a half days on therapy and 1.5 to 2 days off therapy. So 36 to 48 hours off therapy was necessary to allow the hiding forms to come out of hiding and transform back into the more vulnerable but invasive form of Borrelia. And I found that if you stayed off longer than 48 hours, you had such a severe Herxheimer reaction that the patients couldn't tolerate that. And I found if you used it less than 12 days, it wasn't enough time to kill off the new crop of bugs that had transformed from the hiding form back into the invasive form.
Wow, that is just great to hear your experience and really professional take on that. That's really great information to give the listeners for the Chronic Lyme Disease Summit. Let's switch gears a little bit in Lyme disease. And what are some misconceptions that you see as a, practitioner in the Lyme world that's being talked about, whether it's the media or just the common belief about Lyme that you think is important for people to understand?
Well, and this is not true just of the general public, but even a lot of physicians have misconceptions about Lyme disease. For example, they think that Lyme disease only exists in the northeastern United States. As I mentioned earlier, it's found in every state of the United States as well as most other countries around the world. The other misconception is that all patients recall a tick bite or a bullseye rash, but at least 30% or more do not remember either a tick bite or a bullseye rash. And another major misconception is that the ELISA is a very sensitive screening test, but we know, according to research, that the ELISA blood test misses the diagnosis in at least 30% of the time. The Center for Disease Control has on their website that the two-tier testing with ELISA or immunofluorescent followed by Western blot is for research purposes. It was never intended to be something that you do for treating patients on a daily basis. And they say even on their website that if you have a patient with a negative ELISA or immunofluorescent and a negative Western blot, that you should seek alternative diagnosis if you still strongly suspect clinically that the patient has that. So their CDC is covering the rear end, if you will, saying that, you ought to keep looking for it if you think it's there and find some other way to diagnose it. And one of the ways is with polymerase chain reaction, a DNA test for Borrelia. The Infectious Disease Society of America says, well, that's not a valid test because it just says that there's still residual DNA in the body from all the dead microbes that are no longer there. But if the polymerase chain reaction quantitative test is rising, then that's probably not so. So you can always do a quantitative test, for the PCR. Now, the other major misconception is that Lyme disease is transmitted only by tick bite. And there's very good evidence, it's increasing all the time, that Borrelia is also transmitted by a variety of other biting insects. I've seen clear evidence that it's transmitted by mosquitoes, for example, as well as lice and mites and other biting critters. But in addition to that, Borrelia almost certainly is transmitted by sexual intercourse. You can find live Borrelia organisms in the semen of men and in the vaginal secretions of women, and you can find it in the saliva. And so that makes it almost certain that you're transmitting it either French kissing or sexual intercourse. And then there's proven live Borrelia organisms in the blood banks. And the blood banks don't screen for Borrelia. They just take the blood from a patient and then give it to another patient. Now, the Infectious Disease Society of America and others say, well, even though there's live Borrelia in there, there's no evidence that transmits Borrelia to the next patient. What planet are they from?
Yeah. Literally, I'm just listening to you and thinking, wow, just literally donating blood, yeah, just if they're not screening for it, and then of course if you need blood in a life altering situation, you need it, but it's something that should, I think, be on people's radars to say, oh, maybe I should, after I'm saved from some catastrophic accident where I need half my body in blood back, maybe going through some different immune boosting protocols to take care of pathogens that could have been passed on through the blood. It's almost scary to think about that they don't even screen for that.
Yeah, no, they don't. And what I believe is that since the antimicrobial herbals that we use in the Cowden Support Program are so safe, they've been tested in animal studies in Guayaquil, Ecuador, and found to be, very, very safe at hundreds to thousands of times the recommended dose. If you're going to get a blood transfusion, why not go on some of those to try to keep the bugs from growing and keep yourself from getting a full-blown infection? It's kind of like, do you close the gate before or after the horse gets out? So my belief is that you really need to, proactive when it comes to Lyme disease. If you think that you've gotten exposure to Borrelia from a tick bite or from a mosquito bite or from a sexual intercourse or from a blood transfusion or something else, don't wait till you got full-blown symptoms. Go ahead and start giving some natural treatment at that point. Those herbal antimicrobials not only have a bug-killing effect, but they also have an immune-boosting effect and a detoxification effect and an anti-inflammatory effect, and all of which are beneficial to the body. But anyway, back to the other misconceptions. There's a belief that when a person gets borreliosis, it's only one microbe that they get. But in almost every case, there's other microbes, like we talked about earlier, the co-infections of Bartonella and Babesia and Ehrlichia and Coxiella and Protomyxozoa and sometimes Microfilaria and so on. So they're getting all, basically a menagerie in there at the time of that exposure, whether it's sexual intercourse or whether it's a bite from an insect or tick or something. So, and then the other major misconception is that a short course of antibiotics resolves all cases of Lyme disease. That misconception has been promulgated by the Infectious Disease Society of America through their treatment guidelines. And that's the greatest disservice that's happened to the people with Lyme disease in this country, I think, in one respect, because they're saying that if you treat with 2 to 4 weeks of doxycycline, that you get rid of all Lyme disease, and that any symptoms that are present after that must be referred to as post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome. And so you say, well, they're not infected anymore. They just have the immune reaction to what used to be there. That's hogwash. There's lots of articles in peer-reviewed literature showing that you can culture the Borrelia out of people that have had a full course of antibiotic therapy. You can identify by gradually increasing levels of the PCR in patients that have already had a full course of antibiotics. And so that's just criminal what the IDSA has done. It turns out that several of the doctors that were on the article that was written, the treatment guidelines for Lyme disease, were also on the payroll of insurance companies that did not want to pay for antibiotic therapy for Lyme disease.
Follow the money.
Yeah, follow the money. So the Attorney General for the state of Connecticut brought suit against the IDSA in court, and in court the judge ruled that the IDSA was wrong, that the patients had been wronged by them printing such hogwash, and the judge ruled that the IDSA had to go back and research the literature again and rewrite the article. Well, to this day, they still haven't done that in a fair and honest way. So people are still believing that IDSA guidelines are, the gold standard, or the doctors are believing that. And so since they're believing that, insurance companies still won't reimburse. So the patients are left in a bad way. And it's the only way I see out of this for patients is for them to recognize that they can get well using natural treatment programs at a tiny fraction of the cost of the antibiotics in the first place, and not try to go with the conventional approach. The other big problem with it, using the antibiotics, when you treat with antibiotics, you kill off not only the bugs that you want to kill off, you kill off a lot of the friendly bacteria in the gut, which then allows the funguses that are in everybody's gut to overgrow and create another illness. Sometimes the fungal illness that patients are left with after antibiotic therapy is worse than the borreliosis that they had before they started antibiotic therapy.
Wow. Just as you were talking about that, my blood pressure was raising, because it is so frustrating to me too that this is propagated and it's still, the quote unquote standard of practice. It just baffles me. So I feel you on that one, Dr. Cowden. I know we're getting, close to the end here, but can you touch on, you talked about toxicity in the fact that white blood cells really don't do well in a toxicity type area of the body, but the pathogens like Lyme and co-infections seem to do. I mean, what role does toxicity play, or even detoxification play, with getting somebody well?
in my experience, is a huge factor. And if you don't pay any attention at all to the toxicity that the patient has, even if you get rid of the vast majority of the microbes to start with herbs or pharmaceuticals, the bugs are going to come back. The ones that survive are going to divide and replicate and make more copies of each other until you got a whole population of bugs again, if there's a toxic environment present, because that toxic environment is conducive to the growth of bugs and not conducive to the white blood cells functioning to get rid of the bugs. So it's absolutely essential to do something about getting rid of the heavy metals and the pesticides and the herbicides and all that other stuff that we get exposed to every day, as well as the biotoxins. The biotoxins that are the chemicals that are produced by the bugs are as toxic or more toxic than all these other man-made chemicals that we're exposed to. So it's very, very important to get rid of those at the same time. So how do you do that? You take metal binders often during the course of the treatment. If you got a mouthful of mercury amalgams, you try to get those out, because every time you chew, you're releasing mercury into the body. It baffles my mind when the U.S. government tells dentists and others that they must handle the silver mercury amalgam material before it goes into the mouth like a nuclear reactive material in a biohazard container. And when it comes out of your mouth, it has to go back into a biohazard container. But the American Dental Association says that while it's in your mouth, it's perfectly safe. So again, what planet are they from?
That's another topic. Raise my blood pressure.
Yeah, but the American Dental Association has the patent on the amalgam material, and so every time amalgam goes in, they get a click charge, paid to the ADA for that happening. And right now, if the American Dental Association acknowledged that mercury in the amalgam was causing health problems, then we would have the largest class action suit in the history of the United States coming against the ADA and putting them out of business. So their very existence requires that they continue to perpetuate a lie. So anyway, that's another.
Well, it's just, when you think about it, though, like you were saying, it's hazardous material before it's in your mouth. Then when it's in your mouth, it's safe. But then when it leaves your mouth or it's removed, then it's hazardous again. It's like, how does it morph? It's not Lyme.
We did another study with Dr. Horowitz up in New York, a clinical study. He found that in his first study that 70% of the patients with chronic Lyme disease would get better, markedly better, with a natural treatment program. Some antimicrobial herbals and some drainage remedies and some metal binders and stuff like that. And he was really elated because those patients that he put on that program were ones that had failed the antibiotic therapy. And he called me excited and said, 70% got better. I said, that's really good for the 70%. Well, what about the 30%? And so he said, well, what do you think we should do about those? I said, well, I probably should come up to your office and evaluate some of those patients in that 30% group and see if there's something else that we should be doing for them. And so I did that. And when I went up there, one of the biggest issues that was keeping people sick was the mercury amalgams that were in their teeth. I mean, some of them were not drinking enough water. Some of them were not, doing any kind of, decent diet. They were eating sugar and drinking Cokes and stuff like that, not eating proper food. Some of them were exposed to electromagnetic fields in high levels, and the electromagnetic fields actually are a big problem because they stimulate the bugs in the body to grow faster and produce more biotoxins. And so the more EMF exposure you get, the harder it is to get rid of Lyme disease and other co-infections. But anyway, when we addressed all those issues, made the patients drink more water, got them to the dentist, got the mercury out of their mouth, did heavy metal detoxification, got them on a cleaner diet, and then modified the program to address all those issues, the percentage of patients that improved that had failed antibiotic therapy went from 70% up to 85%. So it still wasn't perfect because there's so many factors that influence these conditions that you can't probably do that well with an empiric program. But I found that if you can energetically test patients for the things that are going on in their body that have Lyme disease and co-infections, that you can increase that success rate up to close to 95% with energy testing, fine-tuning and individualizing the program for patients.
That's just great. Well, I know there's some newer research that's been out that you've been working on and been part of the CCSVI. Can you talk about that just for a couple minutes here as we're wrapping up?
Yeah, no, that was really fun research. Dr. Zamboni in Italy described in, I think it was 95 was the first case. His wife developed multiple sclerosis, and when he tested her, he was an imaging practitioner. When he tested her, he found that she had stenosis or narrowing or partial blockage of her jugular veins. So he evaluated 65 consecutive patients with MS and found the same thing in all of them. And when he did balloon angioplasties, a lot of them got markedly better, as his wife did. But many of them had recurrences after some weeks or months. And Dr. Zamboni couldn't figure out why they were having recurrences, but that's basically where he stopped. But Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt noticed that all of his chronic neuroborreliosis patients had a lot of the same ultrasound Doppler duplex imaging abnormalities as the patients with multiple sclerosis in Zamboni's study. And that's when I decided to work with an imaging specialist in Dallas to do a study on patients with chronic neuroborreliosis. And what we found is that indeed, a lot of them have the narrowing of the jugular veins or their azygos veins, and they show up actually with ultrasound Doppler evidence by Zamboni's criteria of being at risk for multiple sclerosis. And some of them even had some of the early signs and symptoms of multiple sclerosis. And when we did the scans of the brain, some of them even had the little plaques on the brain scans, even though they didn't have classical full-blown MS symptoms yet. And what we found also is that they all had red or white hot streaks going up their neck where the jugular veins were, which means there's inflammation in the jugular veins. So when we did energy testing, we found that there was Borrelia and Bartonella and Babesia and these other Lyme-related microbes in the jugular veins. So the inflammation inside the jugular veins was causing a scarring, which was causing a gradual blockage or narrowing of the jugular vein and preventing blood from flowing out of the brain into the chest, which was then causing a back pressure into the brain, which was then causing the risk for multiple sclerosis. So we gave the patients with this complex of symptoms and imaging findings the natural herbal antimicrobial agents and some drainage remedies, and had them shine an infrared light over the jugular veins about 30 minutes after each dose of the herbal antimicrobial agents for several months. And when we saw them back in follow-up, the red streaks and white streaks on their neck were gone. The ultrasound Doppler imaging was now normalized, no longer met Zamboni's criteria, and the neurological symptoms were markedly improved. So what we now know from that little pilot research that we did is that very likely you can reverse multiple sclerosis in a lot of patients just using that simple approach.
Wow. What groundbreaking information. That is just phenomenal. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Cowden, for joining us on the Chronic Lyme Disease Summit. It's really been a pleasure to interview you and pick your brain and see all the things that you understand about, Lyme disease and really getting somebody well. And as you've heard from Dr. Lee Cowden, Lyme is a dangerous, morphine type of bacteria. You definitely want to take a comprehensive look at Lyme to get somebody well. And it's really important too with Lyme disease and other mysterious illnesses that we just look at the body as a whole holistically. And that, just like Dr. Cowden was saying, Lyme is more than just a tick bite. So definitely take this life-saving, life-transforming information home with you by clicking on the banner beside or below, and definitely be sure to share this with your friends and loved ones. They're depending on you. And don't forget to visit Dr. Lee Cowden. His website that you can go to is acimconnect.com. So it's acimconnect.com. You'll not be disappointed. Maximum blessings. This is Dr. J. Davidson.